Hello, everybody. I'm here with Mr. Dan Sedan. He is a broker and is a man involved in the pecan industry for many years. And so I'm very thankful for you that you're going to help me put some information around the industry to see what we can learn about the marketing and numbers and pricing, and so we can understand a little better how this industry works. Welcome, Dan, and it's all yours. Introduce yourself and let the people know who you are. And probably a lot of them don't know you, and some of them may know you, but go ahead. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Arsenio, for the opportunity to be involved in this podcast. I think it's important that we get as much good information out to our constituents, our partners in this industry as possible. I think this is a good format. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dan Zedan. I am the president of Nature's Finest Foods, which is a multi-nut marketing and brokerage company located in Batavia, Illinois. I've been in the pecan business and in the nut business in general for 37 years. The bulk of that time, first 35 years or 30 is with as the vice president of Navarro Pecan Company. In 2021, January 21, when Mr. Martin passed away, I left Navarro, figuring I would continue to do the brokerage business because we do handle large volumes of almonds, walnuts, pistachios, et cetera. But I was going to get slowly wind down my career when I was approached by the partners at Pecan Grove Farms, which is the fifth largest grower of pecans in the United States and the largest grower in Texas. And they asked me if I would be interested in becoming a partner in their business to vertically integrate their company. In other words, put together a pecan shelling operation for them. Develop their marketing strategies, branding, et cetera. And so for the past almost, I guess, 2.5 years now, in addition to being president of Nature's Finest Foods, I have also been the executive vice president of sales and marketing for Pecan Grove Farms. So for those of you who do know me, you know that I put out a regular newsletter with market information in it. I am a published author. I have published articles for numerous industry magazines, but not just industry magazines, but the New York Times, the Dallas Morning News, and I've been featured twice on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. So I do consulting work both for colleges, universities. I've done consulting work for the government of South Africa, the government of China, and a number of law firms and investment firms, both in North America and in the EU. So hopefully that gives me some sort of qualification to talk about pecans.
Well, that's impressive, Dan, and thank you. Yes, it is important to state that you're no rookie. I mean, you walked the mile here, and I think we're going to bring a lot of information to the light. And one of the first things that I will like to ask you is, what are the different ways that pecans are marketed? Because we see, when we talk about pricing, we see reports and one of the prices go to China, and then some of the products are sold directly and retail. So what are the differences of marketing so we can have a better understanding of the different ways that pecans are marketed?
Okay, basically, you're either going to shell the product and sell the kernels, and that may mean you have to do something to them, or you sell them raw, or you're going to sell the in-shell. Back in 1986 to 1990, there was actually a fairly substantial in-shell market in North America. However, that's changed as the consumption patterns of the American consumers change. We've gone more to a ready-to-eat type market, or easily prepared. And so the old days when people would take their nuts out and crack the nuts and then eat the kernels, most of the younger generation doesn't want to do that. They just want to go and pick up the box, eat it. In fact, if it's already pre-cooked, that's even better. So today, about the only in-shell market left in the world of any substantial size is China. And that's because they've developed a unique product that the Chinese like. The consumer in China doesn't, in general, does not have a lot of money. And so what they've done, and for those who aren't aware of it, is they take the in shell, they crack it by hand. They don't take the shell off. They just simply put a crack in it. It's sort of like eating roasted and salted pistachios or in shell peanuts.
Right?
They then soak that cracked pecan in a flavored solution. It could be a brine solution. One of the more popular varieties is a vanilla flavored solution, etc. They do that for about 6 to 12 hours. They then dry roast it and they sell it to the consuming public like that. And you'll oftentimes see, Chinese consumers walking down the streets, whether it's Beijing, Shanghai, or whatever, and they're eating, they're cracking open the nuts and eating the kernels that way. And the bulk of the product sold in China is eaten that way, although we have seen them slowly develop a liking for the kernels. In North America and everywhere else around the world, again, because the Western consumer, I guess, doesn't have the time or doesn't want to take the time to take the shell off, is looking for ways to eat pecans and enjoy them without having to go through the work. So the retail segment is probably by far the largest segment of sales in North America and the EU in particular, where the products are sold as raw kernels in a bag. They're sold in bulk in produce departments of large retail operations. They are added to mixes, and these mixes may have fruits, nuts, or other items in them. They also go into a number of industrial products. Bakery, for instance, is probably the largest segment, or distribution channel outside of retail, where the nuts go into a number of different items, whether it be cakes, breads, cookies, whatever. And what we have found over the years is that in that channel in particular, if pecans are usually priced, it can be priced somewhere around $1 a pound within the price of walnuts. Even though they're more expensive, the baker will consume or buy the pecans because they have a better flavor profile. They're much more versatile. They have just as many nutrients, if not more. In fact, they're the highest nut. In fact, they're the eighth highest food when it comes to antioxidants, behind blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, etc.
Oh, that's good.
And so the pecan, and as I tell people, pecans have a much better, like I say, flavor profile. When they ask me, well, what's the difference? I said, well, you see this piece of paper? That's what walnuts taste like. Okay. Pecans have a much richer, sweeter flavor because they do have a little bit more sugar in them than walnuts do, but they also have a higher oil content. So those are the primary channels they go into. In North America, we're kind of unique in that we have butter pecan ice cream. Butter pecan ice cream is either the fourth or fifth largest seller of anybody, behind vanilla, chocolate, and I think it's cookie dough is the next one in there, and then mint chocolate chip. But then you have butter pecan, which is a built-in consumption base for us, because being that it's one of their top sellers, regardless of what happens to the price, that they're not going to quit making butter pecan ice cream. We have some other advantages in the bakery industry. Everybody talks about pecan pies. Well, it actually is a big segment of the bakery market, particularly in the fall of the year.
Okay.
And then, of course, you've got large companies like, say, for instance, Mrs. Fields, that put pecans in their cookies. Their chocolate chip pecan cookies are very popular. You also have, in the confectionery industry, probably the most popular item is turtles, which are pecans covered with caramel and then covered with either milk or dark chocolate. So we have some advantages, and so those are and I probably got a little long-winded there, but those are some of the primary areas where our products are going into the consumer.
What about the retail businesses like you see in some of the highways and that, or small growers that sell direct? Does it amount for a big part of the crop in
No,
West,
no,
the
no, it does
small
not.
segment?
And we're kind of unique there in that respect. You don't see, if you drive through California, where basically all the almonds are grown, and then the predominant amount of pistachios and walnuts, you don't see the roadside stands There are some, I'm not saying there aren't, but their roadside stands have dried fruits, particularly figs, dates, mango, any number of other things. And then they have, a variety of nuts, but those are limited. They're not like what you see in the southern United States or on some of the back roads in Mexico, where, a local farmer will put in a cracker, whether it be a Meyer or a Champion, or he might, if he can, he'll afford a Savage and he'll put it in there. And then he'll sell it on the roadside. As far as total volume, it's minimal. We do have in our industry a gift pack business, which you will not find in the other nut categories, almonds, walnuts, pistachios. They don't have that. Now, you do have specialty companies like, say, for instance, Harry and David's, that will bring in these nuts and they'll sell them, during the holidays. But the pecan industry is unique in that you've got a number of companies that specialize in gift pack and mail order sales of pecans. And that business, while it doesn't amount to a huge volume, it does register as a pretty good outlet for particularly a small entrepreneur, as long as they understand that in certain countries or certain states there's going to be some food safety regulations they may have to meet, or food handler regulations they might have to meet.
Okay, but it's not a big part of the crop that is marketed there. And what about web? I mean, Amazon and nuts.com or that line of business, are they doing a big part, or it's also a small
In
part?
some countries, for instance, Korea and China, that's a huge business. They do an awful lot of sales on that. In North America, pecans, that could be a growth area for pecans.
Okay.
It is done right now, but it does not compare to some of the other items, and it certainly doesn't compare to, like I say, for instance, Korea's got a huge e-commerce business over the web, and they have actually shows where, sort of like we do here in the United States, the market shows where they actually, show it on TV and say, if you buy this now, you can get X number of pounds for this price, and we'll throw in whatever. So I think that's a potential growth area in the United States. But it has not been exploited yet, because basically everything that we produce over the last several years has been consumed. And so, people ask, well, gee, why don't we sell oil? Almonds sell oil, almonds sell milk, almonds sell butter, almond butter. Why don't we? The reason almonds can do that is they have an oversupply every year. We in the pecan industry don't have a year after year oversupply. Peanut butter is by far the largest selling item in the peanut industry. The reason being is that they have so many peanuts. That's one way to get rid of them, and you can cover up a lot of problems by putting, in other words, you don't have to have fancy product to make peanut butter. You don't have to have fancy product to make peanut oil. The pecan industry, because we don't have that oversupply yet, we have not gotten into that. The other thing we also need to remember is that the almond industry in particular has probably one of the most effective marketing orders in the history of marketing orders. And a marketing order is a government-run program that allows the industry to self-assess itself and use that money to do market promotion, research, et cetera. The American Pecan Council in the United States was founded in 2016, so we're way behind that curve. But even if we had started when they did, the almond industry produces on a kernel basis somewhere between 2.6 and 3 billion pounds of kernels. Okay,
Those are a lot of product.
a lot of kernels. And when they do their assessment, each year they have about $120 million a year to spend on marketing and research. The pecan industry, by contrast, our entire crop is barely the size of 1 month's shipments out of the almond industry. And whereas the almond industry has $120 million a year to spend on marketing, the pecan industry has about $5 million. Now, that's changed a little bit with the advent of the American Pecan Promotion Board, which is unique because the pecan industry in the United States is the only industry that's allowed to have both a checkoff and a marketing order. And if you want, we can discuss the differences later. But even with the addition of the checkoff, we're only talking about $5 to $6 million a year that really can be dedicated to marketing and research and promotion. One of the funny things I hear lots of times, gee, I see pistachios have this big Super Bowl commercial. Well, if we were going to run a Super Bowl commercial for the pecan industry, that would literally use up our entire budget for one 30-second commercial. So we have to be very judicious as an industry how we do that. And that means that we have to rely more on individual companies or this new thing called web, the web, internet, whatever, to be able to get the message out that pecans are just as healthy, if not more healthy than other nuts, but we do have advantages that need to be taken advantage of. And as the production grows, and it will grow, there's countries, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, Australia are all planting pecans. Eventually, we'll get to a point where we can economically make pecan oil and pecan butter and pecan milk, but right now that's really not in the mix.
Okay, well then, now that you brought in the almonds and walnuts, what is the main difference about the way we, as an industry on pecans, market our product, and the difference with those guys in California and walnuts and almonds, especially the way the pecans the way their nuts are marketed? Because I've heard that there's a different way that we run on cash basis, and they have programs. Why don't you give us more detail about that?
And it's important to understand why California is different. Okay, when the California almond, walnut, pistachio, growers started out, everything was grown in that one valley, the San Joaquin Valley. Basically, it's about 60 miles wide, 200 miles long. The growers all were faced with the same issues. They had the same water issues, the same environmental issues, the same labor costs, government regulations, etc. And so they got together and formed cooperatives. And at one point in time, the Diamond Walnut Cooperative accounted for over 60% of the walnut production in California. Today, Blue Diamond growers, and this number may be off a bit now because I haven't kept up with the exact numbers, but they still account for 40% or more of the almond production in California. And so what they did to help the grower out and to develop their markets, growers in effect became processors.
Okay.
And now they may have had two different sets of books, but growers in effect became processors. And what they did, because very difficult to come up with cash, particularly when you're talking about the size of the commodities involved, they would say, okay, if you, a grower, want to come with us, whether you want to be in our cooperative or whether you want to be in our marketing proposal or whatever, we would like you to commit, say, 5 years of your crops, the next 5 years of your crops to us. And what we'll do is when you bring that crop in, we'll give you a certain percentage of the money up front based on what the market is on that day. Okay. And then we, as the processor, and in this case, Blue Diamond still does this, over the course of the year, we will sell those kernels. And by the end of the year, which we have up to 12 months to complete the year, at the end of the year, we will average what that price was and pay you based on what we were able to sell the product for. And so if the market goes up, you, the grower, get the profit. If the market goes down, you, the grower, take the heat. Okay. And we will share in that with you. Okay. The advantage to that is that they don't have to put money up front to finance that crop. Now, the money that comes in fact, the processor can actually then use that crop to get financing to improve his plant and whatever. And that comes out of the cost that eventually they get returned to the grower. Pecans, on the other hand, are grown in 16 different states and now a number of other countries, including obviously Mexico, which is now the largest producer in the world. Trying to figure out what is advantageous cost-wise or marketing-wise for a grower in Georgia, for instance, is very different than what is advantageous or cost-effective, et cetera, to a grower in New Mexico.
Okay.
Basically, and this is where the Mexican crop is very similar because you are growing primarily Westerns and Wichitas.
Yes, you're right.
Your biggest cost is generally water. Okay, how are you going to get the water? You don't have to worry about pests because if you're in the desert, most of those pests don't exist. Okay, Georgia, on the other hand, water's not the issue. The water, becomes down and not that it's not important, but you have to worry about scab, and you got to worry about, stink bug, and you got to worry. I mean, I could go down the whole list of things. For instance, some growers in Georgia have to spray 19 times in a season just to minimize the amount of scab on their pecans. That's unheard of in New Mexico or Arizona. You don't have to generally spray for scab, okay, because you're not going to get those type of rain situations. So what that did was, in effect, unlike California where everybody had the same issues, so they banded together, all of a sudden the Georgia guys say, well, I got this cost. I've got to get so much money for this. And mine, because of this, mine should be better than, say, for instance, Texas or New Mexico. So you had within the pecan industry, you had growers fighting growers. Add on to that is that with only one or two exceptions in FICO, which was Green Valley, other than them and some smaller operations like Stallman, Nut Tree, Leonard Farms, most growers were not shellers. And so the growers had to turn around and sell to the shellers. Now, the shellers, they had to cut their cost. And so each year you're recreating the wheel, and they would have to come up with cash. The banks will not loan a sheller 100% of the value of that crop. So if you've got a company that shells, let's just say 50 million pounds a year, the banks will only loan you about 70 to 75% of that. Okay. The rest of that money, the sheller has to come up with cash. Otherwise, the grower doesn't give it to him. What that does is it puts the sheller at a significant disadvantage, particularly when we look at when the big corporations come into the market. The big corporations come in and they want to contract their product in November, December. Well, heck, 50% of our crop doesn't even start harvesting till December. So the shellers are having to, as I would put it, bet on black that they're going to be able to cover those contracts. And the only way to cover the contracts at a price that's going to make money is they have to go back and negotiate hard with the growers. Now, in those years prior to the 2020, when interest rates in the United States were very low, and I know that interest rates in Mexico are very different, so please, I understand that. But when in the United States, they were basically giving money away. It was one thing. The shellers, it was a little bit easier to come up with money. But now interest rates are considerably higher. We have inflation, and of course, all growers understand the inflation. I mean, when our fertilizer costs went up over 400% in 1 year, and our fuel costs go up 70%, that makes it tough. And so we need cash to cover that. Well, the shellers have to figure out how to come up with cash, and that means they've got to finance it. That puts us at a huge disadvantage when we're competing against almonds, walnuts, pistachios, who don't have to come up with that type of financing. So as an industry, and we've seen a slow, gradual change in this area over the last couple of years in particular, particularly when Green Valley and ADM shut down their operations. We have slowly seen more marketing type agreements, being developed between some of the major shellers and growers to try to offset those costs, but then share in the profits or risk with the grower. So that's the big difference, and why now we're slowly starting to see change. Excuse me. The shellers just can no longer, as a group, I don't care which side of the border you're on, they cannot continue to afford to have to risk everything on pricing. They don't know what their final cost is going to be, and that's a problem. Almonds and walnuts. Almonds start harvest in July, walnuts in late August, early September, pistachios September, October. Pecans don't even start harvesting in the United States till the end of October. Yet the big corporations want their contracts written in November, early December. So those are some of the huge differences that we as an industry need to face as an industry, not as just shellers or as growers, but as an industry, we need to address those things.
You were mentioning FICO and ADM, but what are we looking at? I mean, all those companies are gone. What's happening to the shelling industry? Because they're not, Sansaba is not there anymore. Young is not there. So these companies, they're not able to survive on the long run. So they're not making a profit. or it's what's going on?
No, no, and that's part of the fallacy. And everybody thinks that because the large retailers and the big box stores are selling pecans at $14 a pound, that all of that money's going to the sheller. You know, they say, well, gee, you know, I had to sell my pecans. Like, let's say, friends, right now the market I think is somewhere between 310 and 320 a point. Okay,
Yeah, that's
well,
true.
all of a sudden they see, you know, bag prices on the store shelf in some of the big retailers at $14 a pound. They say, my God, you know, the sheller's making all kinds of money. That's not the case. The sheller's not making that money. In fact, the sheller today is making less than he did even a year ago on the differential. And what the retailers have done is, as they have driven the market down, they have not changed the price dramatically on the store shelves. They're just putting that money into their pockets. It's going to their bottom line. And that becomes a problem. The other thing that people don't realize that the shellers have to deal with is that, I don't care which of the big, pick any one of the major retailers or the major grocers or the major box stores. And I'm talking about the Costco's, the Walmarts, the Kroger's, the Publix, you know, all of these, they're all on 90 to 120 day payment terms. In other words, they're not going to pay the sheller in less than 90 days unless you want to discount the invoice.
Okay.
And so the sheller not only has to put money up front to pay the grower for those that have to have cash, and then he's paying the interest on that. He now, in effect, has become the banker to these big retail chains because he's not getting his money for 90 to 120 days. That's why companies, you know, that you mentioned are no longer business. Now, some of them get bought out. You know, Young is now part of National Pecan, which really is now part of Diamond Walnut. San Saba is now part of Chase Farms, but those other companies are gone. You know, I could pick, you know, Ross Smith, Gold Kissed, and, you know, Leonard Farms, Nut Tree. I could go down the list of companies that have gone out of business because of the cash nature of the business and the fact that you have to, if you don't understand the market and what the potential dynamics are in the market, as somebody once told me, if that's what your choice is, take all of your money, walk into Caesar's Palace and bet it all on black because you've got a better chance of breaking even. And that's what the shelling industry's had to deal with. When I got into the industry in 1986, there were probably 100 shellers in the industry. That's not the case today. You can count them on two hands. And of those shellers on the two hands, you probably got 6 that account for 80% of all the business that's done in the world. So can you imagine if you're shelling 100 to 120 million pounds of pecans, but the bank is only going to finance about 70% of it? So take 100 million pounds times, let's just say, even $3 a point. But you got to come up with a lot of cash. That's the problem in the industry. And then on top of that, you then have to finance all the big guys if that's who you're doing business with, because they're not going to pay you in less than 90 or 120 days unless you want to discount the invoice.
And so that's a negotiation that they make on a very uneven surface. I mean, the big retailers, they're pretty much control how the pricing and the contracts are being written.
Correct. The big retailers and the contracting period has changed. When I first got into the business in 1986, most contracting with the big retailers was done the end of December or primarily in January. The big retailers realized, well, why wait that long? If we do it earlier, we've got a better chance of getting a better price. And they have all moved their contracting to November, and in some cases, the end of October. And then you do have some that still do it in December, but very little of the big business is done in January because they know that if you got a plant, and again, let's just take 100 million pound plant. Right now, there's probably 3 shellers that have 100 million pound operations. When you build that 100 million pound operation, you are assuming certain cost as long as you can operate at full capacity. If you cannot operate at full capacity, and this may sound odd, that fixed cost becomes a variable cost. And that variable cost is determined by how many pounds you're running through that plant under capacity. So the big shellers, in order to keep that fixed cost fixed, are going to do everything they can to get as many pounds, to get as close to that 100 million pounds as possible. And it doesn't matter whether you're a 50-pound sheller, probably 50 million pound sheller, or a 10 million pound sheller. If you don't operate at that capacity, your fixed cost becomes a variable cost. And in a market like today, where the interest rates are where they are, that variable cost, which was a fixed cost, will eat you alive. And that's what happened to ADM and FICO. And so FICO ended up, shutting down Green Valley. They got out of the shelling operation, but they stayed in the growing side of the business. ADM, who never was a grower, just simply got out of the business altogether. And it was so bad. They wanted out of the business so bad that they literally gave away their plants. Now, they obviously sold them, but at a fraction of the cost they paid for them initially. And the biggest problem that our industry has is that every time that happens, we lose additional capital. Because when a company like ADM comes in, they have capital that didn't come out of this industry. And they were putting money into the industry when they lost literally hundreds of millions of dollars and had to pull out. That's now capital that we don't have as an industry. And if the industry doesn't change how we finance our inventory, we will see more people go out of business. We know that one good-sized, mid-sized sheller went bankrupt earlier in the year. Now, they were able to find a buyer, but they're a shell now of the company they were before that, and it'll take them a while to get back, to where they were, because there's a huge amount of capital that's got to be invested. It's unlike almonds and walnuts, pecans. The shelling operation is a very capital-intensive business. Now, on the grower side, your return on investment takes 10 years. Okay. But, almonds, for instance, you can plant the tree today, and 3 years down the road, you have a full crop. It's very simple. So if you have an oversupply situation, you take the tree out of the ground, and then you plant corn or sorghum or whatever for 2 or 3 years till the market turns around. Then you replant the tree, and within 3 years, you're back to full production. You can't do that in the pecan industry.
No.
And so these are things that if you don't understand how that works and what the risks are that are being taken on both sides of the process, you're destined to lose money and eventually be out of the business.
This situation you're explaining, would that reflect what happened 5 years ago, that they were looking at prices of $5 a point, $5.50 a point, and now we're looking at prices that are not for the growers, not for breaking even price? What explained that $5 pricing, and what explains this $3 pricing? Was it because of the capital being invested by these big companies, or it has something to do also with China, or in a combination?
There's a combination of things that have occurred. Okay. And I call them macroeconomic circumstances. Okay. And these are things that occurred primarily outside of our continent. Okay. Obviously, there was, in the United States, there was a change in administrations in 2020. Prior to that change, though, the United States and China got into a trade war, which is still going on.
Yes.
And at one point in time, the Chinese put a 47% tariff or whatever it was on pecans. I think it's 22% today. What that did is that immediately that dropped consumption, because up until then, the United States was shipping on its own approximately 80 million pounds of in-shell pecans to China a year.
Okay.
That went from 80 million pounds to 11 within a year.
Whole lot.
Okay. Huge difference. All of a sudden that floods the market, prices come down. About a year later, the industry had absorbed some of that. We actually saw consumption of kernels actually increase, because the shellers had to find other places to put this in shell. And then what happens? We get a pandemic, COVID. And then COVID literally shut down the entire food service industry. And when I talk about food service, I'm talking about restaurants, I'm talking about small bakeries, I'm talking about, small cafes, et cetera, small business. I mean, people were confined to their houses. They weren't allowed to, go out. And so we saw that downward trend continue. And it continued for, at least, another year and a half. In fact, I think I've got a graph here. Let me see if I've got
Yep.
this graph here. Hold on a second. Yeah, hold on a second. Let me put this up here. I'm going to share my screen here with you. Okay. Share. And let me put this up.
Okay.
Okay.
There you go.
If we're looking at this graph, okay, this is a graph that shows the price comparisons of fancy junior mammoth halves and fancy medium pieces since January of 2017. Now, why did I pick January of 2017? Because right here at this point, if you can see my arrow here, in
Yes,
basically July of 2017, the US-China trade war began. And you can see the market up until that point, we were hovering at prices up near $7. Now those were highs. Okay, we hadn't seen that only but one time before, but they were still hovering up in that range. But as soon as that occurred, the market began to fall. Okay, and it continued to fall until approximately what we saw was right in this area here. Okay, in fact, this point right here. Now, you'll also notice that the price of pieces is different than the price of halves. What happened here was Mexico had two record crops in a row, and they were not really good quality crops, in which they generated a lot of pieces. So the differential between the price of halves and pieces began to increase dramatically. You see where it was back here in 2017, they're basically identical. By January or so of between November and January, we hit a significant differential. At one point in time, this differential reached over $2 a pound. Okay,
wow.
But just about the time the market starts to move up, we start to recover from the trade war. Then we have in January of 2020, right here at this point, is where COVID happens. And what happens? COVID shuts the market down again. We have since, and what changed this differential, you notice that the price of pieces and the price of halves has changed. And today, actually, pieces are trading higher than halves. What happened is that Mexico and the United States had two very high quality crops. So you had a situation back here where the sheller was getting an average of about 60% halves. Right now, the shellers are getting 80% halves. Well, that's a huge difference between halves and pieces. So there's a shortage of pieces. Our concern right now, of course, is, if the quality goes back down, are we going to see this, go back? But anyway, those are two, what I consider to be macroeconomic situations. If I go to the next slide, and I think I can do this, there it is. Okay. Since 2011, now this bottom line here is the price that is returned to the grower, assuming a 50% nut meat yield. Now, I picked 50% because that's what the American Pecan Council uses as their average, amount of, yield, pardon me. Okay. So I take the USDA. USDA every May publishes the average price return to the grower, both for natives and improved varieties. These are improved varieties. So if you're growing, and of course, this improved variety includes Stewart's, Eastern varieties as well as Western. So if you're growing Westerns, which obviously our Mexican counterparts are, this is actually going to be a little bit better. But my point is that taking that average price that the U.S. government says is being returned to the grower, and then the average price of junior mammoth halves. And why do I pick junior mammoth halves? It's pretty much the standard. Junior mammoth halves and medium pieces are the two primary kernelized versions of pecans that people want to buy. This average spread since 2011 has been $1.47. However, today, That spread's only $1.14. Now, based on the Boston Consulting Group, the average cost to shell pecans, average, is $1.20.
Okay.
Okay. So that means the pecan industry right now is actually selling pecans for less than what, they're not making money. They're losing.
Wow.
Okay. And the reason being is that there are other macroeconomic conditions going back on. Let me go back to the stopping share for a moment here. Okay. The other macroeconomic conditions that since 2020, the world has been in an inflationary spiral, primarily, or upward trend, primarily because of COVID. That's increased our interest rates. So whereas, as I indicated, back in 2019, 2020, you could get your money you were paying if you were lucky if you had to pay 1 or 2%. Today you're paying 8%. Okay. In Europe, that number is almost double. We have an inflation rate right now in the United States. I think the last one was 3.9%. In Europe, that's almost double. And then you add on the Ukraine war. Now, the EU is the second largest export market for North America. Ukraine and Russia supply approximately 90% of all the natural gas to the EU. They're in a war, so now they don't have natural gas. Can you imagine what their fuel costs have gone up to?
Yeah.
So if you're a European, and by the way, we're going into another winter, and you're not sure what your natural gas are going to cost, do you buy a bag of pecans or do you worry about heating your house?
Makes no sense.
Exactly. And
wait
now
for
what we've added a new war. Okay, now we have a war in the Middle East. Now, hopefully this war will be a lot shorter, but it's going to go on for a little while. In the Middle East, and I'm talking about Dubai, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, those countries are probably our third or fourth largest export market. And now that has got an issue. So these macroeconomic conditions are what are creating some of the instability in the market today. And the example I give in the United States is that the cost of eggs in the last year and a half went from $1 a dozen to $5 a dozen. I don't know what it is in Mexico, but that's what it was here in the States.
Okay. Yeah, it was.
Okay. Well, again, and the cost of gasoline went from $2.89 a gallon to, in some cases, over $5. So again, if you're the American consumer and you have to make a decision between eggs or milk or gasoline for your car and a bag of pecans, what's going to win? Now, with that doubt in mind, this is how it then gets back to the sheller. Let's take the big retail chains, whether they're Walmart, Kroger, whatever. They don't know what their consumer is going to buy because now they've had to raise prices on everything else. So is the consumer going to continue to buy nuts, or are they going to have to take that other income that they would have spent on nuts to pay for eggs, milk, etc.? And so since the big retailers aren't sure what they're going to buy, they don't come back and buy as much as they normally do, or they do their best to beat up the sheller because at these interest rates, do they want to be holding inventory in their warehouses? The answer is no.
But they're not lowering their pricing. I mean,
No,
you see these
no.
prices that are high. They're not concerned about the volume that is being moved. They're just concerned about the profit margin they have on their product on the shelf. And so we need to move the inventory because from the grower side, that represents most of us, we need to see better pricing because we're running below the survival line. And in the medium term or short term right now, a lot of businesses are going to go bankrupt. A lot of farmers are going to lose their operation. And so there's going to be a shortage of pecan if things don't change. And so, but the big retail companies, they're not looking at the big picture because it's not in their priority, I guess. But things need to change somehow. Otherwise, we're going to go, the industry is going to go with less and less production.
Right. And this is, so when we look at the current supply situation, we have the lowest supply since 2016 when prices were at $7 a pound. Yet we're selling the product at about $4.40. Why? Because even though we have a very short supply, the major marketers and the major markets, for instance, the EU exports to the EU last year out of the United States were down 26%. If they don't know if they're going to be able to sell it, they're certainly not going to buy it. And so what is basically a very short supply becomes an oversupply. And this year, in my most recent newsletter, one of my most recent newsletters, I pointed out the fact that we have the lowest supply since 2016, but we've got prices that are $2.50 a pound cheaper. We have a unique situation going on right now in our market. The shellers, we have the lowest carry out in almost 10 years. And the shellers are basically operating hand to mouth. As the shellers would hopefully show some restraint and tell the big retailers, hey, we're not going to sell that price because we got this issue. The problem is going back to that 100 million pound shelling operation. They want to operate at full capacity, so they lower their prices. And when they do that, then they have to go back to the grower and say, gee, I'm not going to pay any more than this. This year's kind of unique because if indeed, and if as a sheller, I can't say, the shellers, because there's what they call the Sherman Antitrust Act in the United States, which prohibits big companies from collaborating to fix the price.
Yes.
However, the Sherman Antitrust Act generally doesn't apply to growers. And we have a situation now where instead of if we could, as an industry, shrink the supply further to where the shellers could not get what they need to handle their month-to-month operations, they would be forced to pay the grower more to get the product. What we cannot do as an industry, and this is what we saw happen a year ago, is that growers panic and they sell everything at the cheapest price possible just to get the cash. What that does is it lowers the entire overall market, and it feeds upon itself. We as an industry have an opportunity right now, and this is a unique year just because of the supply situation. If we were to stand firm and not panic, and I understand people need cash. Certainly the big growers could afford to hold off, for a couple months. But for those growers who need to have cash, instead of selling the whole thing at one price, only sell a little bit. Try to restrict that flow at this point in time. That could help to raise the price later on. And I do believe that the Middle East war won't last, months and months and months or years like the Ukrainian war. So that will turn around. But eventually, supply does dictate price. It's not doing it right now because of the macroeconomics. But within the next 6 months, I expect that to change. And for those that can hold out, we need to hold out because that's the only way we're going to move this market up.
But this message or this idea need to get to also to the big retailers or to the final or to the big brokers, because otherwise, if pecans are not on the shelf, we can build a bigger supply that's going to sit there. So we need to do something tactical, I guess, because one question, are we as an industry broker driven or consumer driven? Because like we're discussing right now, it seems like the big retailers are the ones keeping the price down for the sheller and then eventually to the grower. So how do we handle that? Because it's not
there needs to be a joint message, and this is important, and it's only started to change in the last few years. We can no longer say that there's a difference between Mexican pecans and U.S. pecans. We're selling pecans. The consumer doesn't care where they came from, and if you look at it, we're all selling the same variety, basically. Unless you're from, the southeastern United States, basically you're selling a Western or Wichita. That's what's grown in Argentina. That's what's grown in South America. That's what's grown in Australia. All of them came from the United States. So we're selling the same varieties. What we need to do as a pecan industry, not the Mexican industry, not the U.S. industry, not the Australian, etc., as an industry, we need to put pressure on the retailers. Every one of these retailers has a policy that says they want to partner with their suppliers to make sure that everybody benefits. But what they're doing is actually destroying their major supplying source. We as an industry, and this will take the American Pecan Council, the American Pecan Board, Nuez, the big shellers that are dealing with these companies, to jointly get together and make it clear that what is going on, the financing policies that 90 to 120 day terms, and that's not the half of it. There are other things that go on that the grower doesn't understand. For instance, if you go to one of these big box warehouses, if the product doesn't sell within a certain time, they send it back to the sheller and expect the sheller to pay for it. And so those practices as an industry, we need to stop it. And the only way to do that is to present a unified front, again, between all the principal players in our industry, not the United States, not Mexico, but jointly get together and start making our strength known. One of the things I point out all the time, and the pecan industry doesn't do this very well, is that California has only 2 U.S. senators and 30 or 40, whatever it is, congressmen. We have 16 pecan producing states in the United States. That's 32 senators. That's a third of the U.S. Senate. We need to put political pressure on our senators and our congressmen, and we need to do it as a unified industry to get the retailers to understand that they are destroying their major suppliers.
Because if situation keeps like this, it may happen different things. Growers will go direct to survive, or will try to get into shelling industry. But as you mentioned before, just shelling, it does not solve the problem, because you're going to compete with some other shellers, and you're going to end up trying to sell to the same big retail stores or the same the distribution chain. So it's the same problem. So I am convinced that promotion is a key factor, so we can move more the industry so it's pulled by the consumer and not by the broker, and trying to send a message that we have a great product that is versatile and all the things we know, and we have to communicate that, because we can no longer be like this for long, because somehow we're going to try to sell at better pricing, because at 320. I think the industry needs at least, on the grower side, it needs around the 360, 380 for the survival line point. And in Mexico, we're hurting even more, because the exchange rate has worked against us. So it's more difficult for us to compete. But what would be a healthy pricing for the industry on the shelling side, and to be sustainable, so we can probably send a message that not the $7 that you mentioned before, it's probably also a problem to market and to compete with other nuts. But what would be a price range that would work for the industry, so we can communicate that?
Ideally, the ideal price for both growers and shellers is somewhere, you said you could make it work at 360 to 380. Really, the price to the grower needs to be around $4 a point.
That's even better, because that $4 would be great, but at this situation, we're just hoping for some light. But if it's $4, it's better, because we're not counting with a lot of capital and depreciation and investment in the new equipment and regulations and all that. Will be much better. But hell, I love to see the $4.
Well, and you're not going to get that overnight, but even at $4 a point, that means the sheller can sell the product between $5.50 and $6 and make a profit. And what we have seen from a historical standpoint is, once the price hits $6 a pound, consumption drops off. But between $5 and $6 a pound, the consumer and the buyers can make money. And ideally, if we could get the price of the in-shell up around $4 a point, the sheller could then sell for somewhere between $5.50 and $5.99. That way it keeps it out of $6, and everybody wins. And the one thing, it doesn't matter which buyer you talk to. Okay, and you can pick any buyer. They're, price only becomes critical when it fluctuates dramatically. So if you could guarantee to a buyer, I don't know, pick one of the companies that you could guarantee a fixed price over X number of years, and let's say 550. Most of them would take it. Why? Because now they know what their cost is going to be. They can then develop their marketing promotion programs. They can develop new products, et cetera, because they now know what the cost is. But when you have the product price go from $7 down to $4, they have no idea what it's going to cost. So they're not going to develop. A good example, and I'll go back to the almond industry. In 1986, the almond industry was producing around 400 million pounds of almond kernels a year. The almond board, and it was primarily spearheaded by Blue Diamond, but the almond board went out and made the decision that rather than worry about supply, let's worry about consumption.
Right.
How do we increase consumption? And at that point in time, and I don't remember the exact date, but at one point in time, the almond industry sold what they call whole and broken almonds. There was just pieces with whole almonds, whatever, and they had a plethora of pieces. They had to figure out what to do with pieces. Well, the almond board went to Hershey and said, these little kisses that you make, what if we could give you a piece of an almond to put in every one of those little kisses? Well, they did it. And it literally, you cannot generally buy whole and broken anymore because they used up all the pieces. So unless they specifically make pieces. And today, the grower is getting, hundreds of times more return than they did in 86. Yet the crop has gone from 400 million pounds to 3 billion pounds. That's because they increased demand. The way you increase demand is you work with companies to create new products, but you also promote what are the benefits. Almond industry and walnut industry got on the health bandwagon real quick, did health studies to show how healthy these nuts were. And then they got the industrial hygienist and the food technologist to incorporate that into their marketing strategies. And we've done a little bit of that. But again, as an industry, we have not promoted the fact that our product is more versatile, for instance, than our biggest competitor, which is walnuts. So we need to focus on increasing that consumption. That is going to require us to figure out how to stabilize these prices, which goes back to the supply, but then be able to have enough supply so that we can create these new products that they're going to create the demand for. Now that, someone's going to say, well, gee, yeah, that's pie in the sky stuff. It's not going to happen overnight, but the industry has to start. And it needs to be done as an industry. Again, it can't be Mexico, United States, Georgia, Texas, whatever. It's got to be the pecan industry. And that's why the APPB has actually allocated some of the assessments coming in to the Mexican, market to try to increase, markets, in Mexico as well.
Yeah, we received the local company, marketing company received $350,000. There's another $150,000 that are going to be allocated. And we're just waiting for the green light from USDA to release all the information and to clean everything. So the lines are correct, that they're not stating anything that that could be pointed by the USDA. And we're going to start. We're just waiting on that. I know I have direct contact with the marketing company, and they're just waiting for that. And I think it's going to bring some light in what we need to do. I am convinced that promotion is the key. I am afraid that on the grower side, we tend to oversimplify a big complex problem that just saying that, okay, it's just that we need to restrict supply and it will solve everything. This is a year, like you were saying, that it will help a lot, and it's something I think we should do, but it won't solve the main problem that going to increase demand, move from broker-driven to consumer-driven, and give the industry a better future, because it's really tough right now.
Yeah, and like I say, we're in sort of a unique year this year. Generally speaking, that's not going to be the case, but it's going to take a combination of things. But promotion is the huge thing. How do we go about pricing our product and getting the market to where it is so that big companies will invest in those new products? And how do we get to the point where, and some say, well, gee, we got to quit planting. Well, yes and no. We'll never be able to make pecan oil profitable if we don't have more supply. We'll never be able to make pecan butter, profitable, or pecan milk unless we have more supply. But to increase the supply now without having those products would be suicide. What we need to do is let's address the current issues. And the biggest issue, let me go back to the biggest issue. If the sheller has to finance his inventory, that's money they cannot use to make a better plant or to do more marketing or whatever. So the biggest issue our industry has to get over is how do you finance the inventory? We need to go more to what I call a California model. And I understand it's not going to be good for everybody, that the smaller guys in particular are going to have to still probably be pretty much on a cash basis. But if the rest of the industry goes to that model, the profits will flow to everybody. And so that's the biggest issue. Change how we finance the inventory and how the risk is shared. Then from there, take that extra money and be able to put it into these other things, i.e. promotion, et cetera. And in the meantime, to help with the pricing, we need to figure out how to restrict supply while we're doing these other things. But the biggest thing, again, I can't reiterate it enough, we have to fix the financing, of this crop every year. And it's got to be year after year. We have to share those costs. We have to share those profits. And it means there's going to have to be changes on both sides of the equation. The shellers have to look at how they change. The growers have to look at how they change.
That's great information, Dan. On our side, on the side of the Mexican Pecan Council Commonwealth, we're trying to focus on providing better information every year and trying to convince the Mexican industry, the Mexican growers into contributing to make promotion, to complement promotion efforts that are going to be made by the APPB. We're working closely with them and to try to complement with the funds and convince the industry and growers that we need to invest in solving the root of the problem, that is more awareness in the consumer, and work with this, like controlling supply. Also give the growers information on what's the possible outcome of a season like we have now in 2023 and 2024, and see if we can do something to benefit everybody. What would be some of the issues that we're not addressing properly regarding quality assurance, or maybe trying to keep underrated pecans out of market, like sprouts, or so they don't contaminate the pricing on our top product? What are the issues that are not being addressed in your perspective?
Well, the biggest thing right now outside of the financing is that the industry does not operate off of a single standard, a single quality standard. The biggest advantage the almond industry, and I keep harping on the almond industry. Let me tell you, if I was a college professor and I was talking about marketing orders or how to change an industry, I would use the almond industry as a good example because they've done a lot of things very well. One of the things they did was they developed a set of standards that is now accepted worldwide. And so it doesn't matter whether I'm in Japan or China or Botswana or whatever. If I order a nonpareil Supreme 2325 almond, I know exactly what I'm going to get. I'm going to get a nonpareil variety. It's going to be a Supreme quality. Supreme is not their top quality, but it is it's the highest one sold in the United States generally. And 2325 is going to tell me the size. But because it's a Supreme, I know exactly how many chips and scratches I can expect in those nuts. I know exactly how much foreign material, et cetera. The pecan industry has been operating off of a 1969 recommendation for the past 50 some odd years. Now, it took 5 years, but we have had a proposed rule that was put out to public comment. The public comment period actually ended on the 11th, Monday. We believe that that standard will be approved by the industry, by the USDA, sometime in March, and it'll probably become effective in the United States sometime in July, June, May, sometime in that time frame, depending on the time frame the government puts on it. However, it's still going to be a voluntary standard.
Wow.
One of the ways to improve quality across the board is to make it a mandatory standard. And that's what the almond industry did. Their standard is mandatory. So every sheller in the almond industry, when they put their almonds in a box, an inspector inspects those almonds and puts a stamp on them that says whether they're extra number one, supreme, whatever it is. And that way the consumer knows exactly what they're getting because the standard is consistently applied. Okay. The pecan industry has been hesitant to do that because, again, the guys in Georgia, or it doesn't matter where you pick them, they don't want to have a government inspector at their plant. Well, in this case, the American Pecan Council, not the APPP, but under the marketing order, the American Pecan Council can make a standard mandatory, which would mean that because not only do we have a marketing order, but we have a checkoff under the APPB that any pecan coming into the United States would have to meet the U.S. standard. And it would be inspected either at the border when it comes across by someone the USDA designates. In this case, they may pick, Department of Agriculture or whatever. But the inspection, other than the kernels coming across the border, in the United States would be done at the shelling operation. The growers wouldn't have to do this. The growers wouldn't have to pay for it. Now you're going to say, okay, well, if it's going to cost the sheller more, they're going to expect the grower to cover. That is true. Okay. But the inspector isn't going to be going to the orchard. The inspector is going to stand outside of the production facility. I don't care, pick whichever major U.S. pecan production. And at this point in time, there's only a dozen or so.
Yeah.
And every case, and again, let's go back. Approximately 75% of all the pecans coming out of Mexico are coming to the United States. Most of them, or a good portion of them, in the form of in-shell. So that means they're shelled at one of these facilities. Anything that comes across the border from some of the shellers in Mexico would be inspected at the border. And if it doesn't meet a U.S., in this case, fancy, they can't label it as fancy. So that means they can't go to Costco and say this is a fancy and sell them choice or sell them standard, because they'll have a stamp on it that says that's what it is. Once you do that, that changes the game, because now no matter where in the world you want to buy those pecans, because the United States, again, goes back, basically sells 80 to 85% of all the world's processed pecans. You now have just changed the standard, which now gives the consumer more confidence what they're going to get. It's sort of like USDA choice or USDA prime when you're talking about beef. So what we can do as an industry is, when that standard is published, and I do expect it'll be published, because we had two industry open forums with the FDA, the USDA, and the comments were all addressed in the publication that, just like I say, the public comment ended December 11th. And both the APC and the National Pecan Shellers Association supported it unanimously. We need then, once it comes out, we need to then pressure the APC to make the standard mandatory. And I know for some people that's going to be blasphemy, because oh my God, you mean I've got to have a government agent? No, only those shellers are going to do it. And again, on this side of the border, you're talking about maybe a dozen or so. And there'll have to be some other things worked out for the real small guys. Obviously the guy who has a roadside stand, there's got to be some exemptions for that. And that the APC has to work out. But if indeed our goal is to produce the highest quality product that we can, so that the consumer has confidence when they go into a Costco or a Walmart or Kroger or Publix or whoever it is, if it says fancy on there, it's been certified. That's what we need to do next. So after we take care of, addressing the financing issue, and we look at how we're going to promote, those standards have to become mandatory.
That's a good idea. I think that's a good idea because also if we put ourselves into the consumer shoes, they need to make sure that they're going to buy a product that is shell-free, that is fresh, that it's not oxidized, and so that won't give the product a bad reputation. And also with that certification, it could be a better control of quality. And at the end, if all those things you're saying go into better pricing for the grower, that will be welcome for us.
Yeah, and the sheller at that point in time. So, for instance, a grower who produces a high quality Western, and again, let's go back to say, let's assume a high quality Western is 58 to 62%, and he sells that to the sheller, and the sheller gets, extra number one or U.S. Premier or whatever grade. He can pay the grower more because he can get more for it. Now, obviously, we're going to get back to, are they going to do like the retailers have done and they don't change the price? They put all that money into their own pocket. That's a whole separate issue we have to address. But if you don't make the change initially, you don't have the opportunity to do that. And that's why I say, the first step, in my opinion, was we needed to get the USDA to put a new standard on there that made sense. And this was a buy-in. We had growers involved in this. We had shellers. So they changed not only the kernel standard, they changed the in-shell standard, but only the kernel standard would be made mandatory. And again, that has to be done by the APC. The APPB cannot do that. The APC can't. And then, in effect, it would be enforced by them as well. But they would use, it's sort of like APPB now using customs to collect the assessment on the Mexican pecans coming in. When they came across the border, when the assessment was collected, they'd also do the inspection at that point in time. And they'd tell you right away, yep, it meets a US number one, it meets a US Premier or whatever the grade's going to be. And that way, when it goes to the consumer, they can put on that commercial package, meets USDA, US number one, or whatever it is, okay, US fancy. And we don't have to worry about hopefully going into a store and seeing black or brown pecans being called fancy because we know they're not. This would change that.
Yeah, well, on the Mexican side, we will try to follow whatever is best for the industry. I mean, for us, it's a little more difficult because the way to enforce the laws and the regulations is way different. Right now, we're trying to push all this effort on a voluntary basis, and we're doing our best. This talk we're having is going to be a great tool for us in Commonwealth to try to spread the word out and to convince growers and members of the industry what we need to do and try to make things better because we need to move fast because things are tough, really.
Well, and what would be helpful? Okay, Nuez, because the Mexican government certainly isn't going to do anything on this, but Nuez represents the pecan industry basically in Mexico. Nuez, as an organization, should be drafting a letter to the American Pecan Council asking that once those standards are approved by the USDA and published, that the APC make them mandatory, because the inspector isn't going to go to Mexico. So, that they don't have to worry about. When it goes to and again, they're not going to inspect the in-shell. They're going to inspect the kernels. So only the shellers are going to have to comply, and they won't have to comply in Mexico. The compliance will occur when it hits the border and they pay that assessment. Customs will at that point in time, or whoever the agency is. In the case of almonds, they use DFA, which is the Dried Fruit Association in California, to do their inspection on behalf of the USDA. The USDA would have to pick who that representative is going to be. But my point is that this adds no cost in Mexico. Now, yes, somebody in the United States is going to, if they got to pay for this inspector, which they will, the sheller is going to have to pay for that inspector to come in and inspect this stuff. And in some cases when you're shelling 100 million pounds a year, that means you've got production coming off every day. So that means they're literally going to have to put an office at their plant for the USDA inspector to inspect everything that's coming off the line. That is a cost. And I'm sure that, what we're talking about, the penny or whatever it is, they'll try to take off of what comes out of the grower. However, What they should be doing, and this is what the emphasis should be, is that cost should be passed on to the retailer, because it's the retailer who's going to be able to clearly define his product on the store shelves. So those things can be explained, and that may be, maybe you do. And I know this podcast has gone on quite a while already, but maybe it includes additional podcasts to educate the Mexican, pecan industry. Maybe it takes, what we call on this side of the border is town hall meetings, where some of us go around and explain the advantages and how the thing works, et cetera. But there's going to be an education issue, but it's going to be critical, because the bulkier pecans in Mexico are coming to the United States. And if, to make it mandatory, the first thing the American Pecan Council and the USDA are going to say, okay, this impacts Mexico. What's their opinion? Well, if Nuez come out and say, hey, we support this and we think it'll help everybody in the long run, that removes that from the equation.
We have a group of shellers that are innovative and open for this. I think if it's something that it's going to be of benefit for everybody, I'm sure that they will be more than willing to put an eye on this and study and see what's best for the industry. So I strongly believe in that the group of guys that are doing the shelling will go for whatever is best for the industry.
And I've talked to several of your larger, I talked to Lon Aguilera, I talked to Humphrey, I've talked to some of the mid-sized ones, for instance, like Galeana or whatever. They understand the value of this, and so far I've received no major pushback. I have also talked to the South African Pecan Association, which is SAPA. I've talked to the Australians, which is primarily Stallman. They're all in favor of it. They think that if indeed we can come up with a standard that is universally accepted, it helps everybody. And one of the things that a universally accepted standard does is it stops, the EU, for instance, came out with a pecan standard 2 years ago that really could create some issues, partly because it's based on the 1969 standard and not on current technologies and stuff. So by us as an industry basically self-regulating and say we want this to be made mandatory, that then checkmates sections of the world like the EU, because they're not going to set a standard that's a whole lot different when basically 80 to 85% of all the production or sales is coming out of North America.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've been going for a while. Thank you very much, Dan, for all the information and the knowledge that you have shared with us. We will be in touch and see what this thing develops, and we can do this and try to educate us as growers and also members of the industry, in trying to understand what we need to do and not oversimplify our problems and get our hands into it to solve it from the root and not just cosmetically, because we need to change things fast, and as an industry in Mexico, we need to convince people to go into these new changes. And so I think it will be great for everybody to understand and listen to what you just shared with us. And I'd like to thank you for that, Dan.
Well, anything I can do, Arsenio. I've known you now for what, almost 30 years or whatever.
Yeah, it's been that long.
Yeah, and I really appreciate what you've done in the Mexican industry. Whatever you need from me, I'll be more than happy to assist. If you need data, if you need me to come down and speak to people or whatever, I'll be more than happy to assist, because I'm interested in making sure that the industry continues to grow and move forward. So just let me know.
I appreciate your words, Dan. Thank you very much. And we will be in touch soon, and we'll keep sharing information. Thank you, Dan.
Sounds good, Arsenio. Thanks again. You take care. We'll talk to you later now.
Bye-bye.